Good afternoon. I'm Ken Sherman, President of IntelliTrans, and I'd like to welcome you to IntelliVision Episode 2, where I discuss with Blake Ezell, our Director of Customer Success and Supply Chain Analytics, how to build a stronger, more resilient, and sustainable supply chain in the future. Blake, if you could, give us a brief introduction about yourself.
Thanks, Ken. So I've been fortunate enough to not just work for a third party, but also work for a shipper and for a Class 1 railroad. So about 10 years or so ago, worked for Kansas City Southern, their carload business unit. And one of the things we did was help shippers to establish new locations, new supply chains, and new opportunities to bring their products to market. Shortly after that, I went to work for Valero Energy and really had some unique experiences there as we navigated energy reform as refined fuels opened up in Mexico, and was able to be one of the folks that led that effort early on. When I came back to IntelliTrans in 2017, the goal was to bring the mindset of not just what does a shipper need or what does that carrier want, but how do you bring that collective goal together? How do you bring analytics to the front to drive decision making, to help conversations that otherwise weren't being had? I wanted to bring that carrier shipper, kind of bring them together with data so that they could have a more meaningful relationship.
Excellent. Well, glad to have you back. So one of the things that's really kind of important at this point is how customers, shippers can use data and data analytics to survive and thrive in a very chaotic world, from a pandemic and the associated shutdowns to us thinking we were coming out of shutdowns to the war in Ukraine, even mixed in there the ever-given turning sideways in the Suez Canal. What would you suggest our customers do to use data and analytics to thrive in such turbulent times?
Yeah, so the first thing is we've got to get out of Excel as much as possible. If you're using data that's coming out of some static Excel, it's old, right? And we've got to get to real-time information so that we can flex, we can make decisions based upon what's going on right now. Good examples are embargoes, right? We can't make decisions based upon potentially what happened 6 months ago or even a month ago. We need to be looking at what is happening as recent as 30 minutes ago. We've got embargoes going on or potentially going on right now, in North America. What shipments are going to be impacted? What customers are going to be impacted? Where are we going to have shutdown information? These are all things that we've got to pull into the mix so that customers can be notified timely, right? We can deal with last minute if we need to make a mode change. We can get the product to our customers so that they're not facing shutdown situations. But it's not possible unless we're using real-time information, and we've got as much information as we can to our fingertips.
Right. Yeah, and so there's a couple of things that, before I was with IntelliTrans, my last two roles at GE Plastics were as the head of the supply chain organization, as a master black belt in the Six Sigma organization. And a couple of things that we really wanted to advocate people do is that complete, timely, accurate data, have all of that in one place. Number two is to not exclude data, and just never look at it, but make sure that you're capturing it and then excluding it for a reason and still able to analyze that. Then the third thing is, when conducting analysis, use the entire data set, minus exceptions that you needed to exclude. Because oftentimes what we see people do is look at only the very good shipments or only the very bad and say, hey, this is common across all the very bad shipments. That must be the root cause. Well, you don't necessarily know if the same thing is also true about shipments that were on time unless you analyze the whole data set. And by taking this approach, what I like to say is you can start separating reasons from excuses. And then you can get down, once you're at that point, you can start looking for corrective actions.
We don't want to use the data to support a predefined decision. What we want to do is use that data to make a conclusion based on the completeness.
Given a lot of the things that are changing so dynamically today, what would you suggest customers do to be able to figure out that something's changing as early as possible and do something about it so they're being more proactive and less reactive?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that we started up, and it's been a couple years now, is our A2I, or Augmented Artificial Intelligence. And so Some of the things that allows us to do is look at out-of-route shipments, look at problematic shipments. We can also, look at shipments that maybe are going adverse to the typical route, but they're okay, right? And so some of the things that it allows you to do is what's going on faster, what's going on sooner. So with A2I, specifically for out-of-route, we know for every shipment, we know where it should be. We have a pretty good idea of when it should be there. And so if we find instances where the location of those cars do not meet that criteria, flags are generated, and so our team then goes in to work on those, to resolve those. One of the nice things about the system, though, is it learns. We have many routes in the U.S. Maybe they're a supplemental route, and so say going through New Orleans, you've got kind of a south side and a low side, and there may not be anything wrong, but we go in and we look to make sure that everything is okay. They don't need to intervene. They don't need to call the railroad to try to escalate the issue. But the system then learns anytime they see that route again that yes, it may be doing something against norm, but it's okay.
What you're kind of saying is that having the services team work hand in hand with the analytics team, they can detect that something that looks wrong isn't wrong and help the machine learn faster.
So Ken, what would you say would be some of the benefits of being a data-driven organization?
Yeah, and so what happens is, many times, especially with the industries where we serve, which have been around for 100 years or more, there's a lot of experience and a lot of, hey, when this happens, we should do that. But with all the things that are changing so quickly these days, sometimes that experience can actually lead you astray. And so by using the data and using the analytics to detect stuff, and then using that knowledge to help inform that, you'll just make better decisions. Like whether I should, divert this rail car from a customer that looks like they have plenty of inventory to a one that does not. Is that going to be the right decision today versus maybe that was the right decision, when PSR wasn't into effect, or when there wasn't a strike looming over the organization, or there wasn't excessive demand for product versus services in the network. So Blake, how would you suggest our customers build agile and resilient supply chains?
I think there's three fundamentals. First, optionality. We've seen it time and time again with capacity constraints or labor constraints. To have that optionality is going to go a long way. The next fundamental would be collaboration with the carriers, planning, having those conversations up front, understanding what the carrier, what they're able to do, letting them understand what you're able to do, from a loading standpoint, from a planning. Those are absolutely critical. The final foundation is just transparency. We've got to know where the shipments are at any given time. We've got to know what's happening with our carriers, with their capacity, their ability to service us right now, where they're having problem spots, so that we can plan in advance and we can communicate with all the parties involved.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that is, in addition to the carriers, is either the supplier for the inbound or for the customer for the outbound, having those parties share either production forecasts on the supplier side or demand forecasts on the customer side. And I don't necessarily mean just like shipments and orders. I actually mean production and demand, because shipments and orders are influenced by behavior of humans around converting that demand into an order. But if you actually share what's going on in the production facilities, that with collaboration and transparency, you'll be much more able to deal with the disruptions that come up on any given day.
So Ken, how do you implement the change when you're bringing about a new agile supply chain?
Yeah, and so this is where I kind of harken back to some of my days at GE and some of the things that they had brought in from external consultants. But we used to use this thing called the change acceleration process, where it would start with creating a shared need. Why do both parties need to make a change? What's in it for me kind of statements. Then a vision of what that future could look like. And oftentimes I suggest to people that they do kind of a reverse imaging exercise. What would the future look like? And then what would you have done to get to that future? And then when you go through that exercise, oftentimes you'll figure out what the plan is to go forward. Then you've got a mobilized commitment, to move that forward. So how do you get people to actually not just understand they need to change, but be a willing partner and actually doing something about it. And then monitoring progress of the initiative. And then maybe the hardest part is sustaining the change. Once it's changed, how do you not just revert back to what you were doing before? So how do you have the right metrics in place? How do you have the right monitoring to get the data into those metrics? Who's going to be responsible for taking actions when those metrics go astray and things like that? As much focusing on the acceptance of the solution, like you not necessarily what you're going to do, but the fact that you all agree to do it, as much as you do focus on the quality of the solution. How do you help a customer achieve savings while also improving service and improving sustainability?
The first thing is mode, right? Are we selecting the right mode based upon cost, based upon transit time, based upon number of factors? The second is going to be the carrier, right? Is it the right carrier, the right route, minimizing deadhead miles, minimizing the interchanges, the junction, the miles. Lastly, you're going to have payload. So are we maximizing the equipment to get the most out of it so that we're not shipping air? So once you've kind of selected those things, right? So typically your optimal mode is going to have the lowest carbon footprint, right? So that's going to help with sustainability. But we also need to bring analytics into this. We need to make sure that those carriers that we are using that they are giving us the best performance, right? We've got on-time delivery, on-time pickup, we've got out-of-route issues, other factors that get pulled into this equation. And so kind of that final piece is once we've got the right mode, the right route, the right carrier, we're getting the most out of our equipment, we're using analytics to make sure that those carriers are performing the way we want them to.
So Blake, that's a pretty good explanation of how you can achieve both savings and sustainability. What else needs to be done to mix improved service into the mix?
Have a system that allows you to scorecard your carriers. We have to know the performance, and not just overall performance. We've got to know, if we're talking trucking, is it on-time pickup or is it on-time delivery? If we're talking about rail, is it performance within a lane but within a segment of the lane? We've got to know how each of those carriers are performing. We also have to know how we're performing. We've got to know, if we're performing for a specific customer, what our delivery is to them, and then have a system to measure and monitor all of it. That way you can benchmark it and you can continue to drive improvement.
Yeah, and one of the things that I would suggest, it's often beneficial to have a third party doing that monitoring, because otherwise parties have an incentive to say, well, this is an outlier, and exclude it from the scorecard, and then trust can get eroded on both sides with that lack of transparency.
Absolutely. We don't want to have a situation where someone is self-reporting. Trust gets kind of brought into the mix. So, I would absolutely agree with that. Have a third party. They're going to be open. They're going to have that transparency. They're basically just showing the data. They're showing all the data.
By having a third party do that and bring all three parties together, it'll allow them to collaborate on kind of joint action plans to drive sustainable, improved service and sustainability impact, and not have it overweighted one way or the other.
So Ken, what role does ESG have in supply chains of the future?
Well, I think they're intimately related. There's a lot of studies out there that say the majority of greenhouse gases come from transportation. And so if you're not thinking sustainability as you're designing your supply chains in the future, you're going to be left behind. Investors look for ESG out of companies, employees look for that. And so it's really kind of quote unquote the right thing to do, but it's also long-term the profitable thing to do. Like we were saying, if you're picking the lowest cost carrier in truck, oftentimes that's the carrier with the fewest deadhead miles. Driving empty is not a good use of the vehicle, both from a cost or sustainability standpoint. So I think as companies evaluate what they're trying to do, they have to look at three things. What is the mode that they're using to move stuff? For the carriers within that mode, are they using ones that are committed to the future, whether it's low sulfur, slow steaming, electric vehicles, or whatever? But also there's a responsibility for both parties to think about the impact their sourcing decisions have on sustainability. So for example, if you could buy something in the United States, or you could outsource it and purchase it from overseas, what's the impact on the environment of the added leg of the supply chain for just the ocean move? Because the land leg is going to be relatively similar or even better if you're sourcing it domestically, because if it's coming in from overseas, it's coming from a port, which is going to be potentially further away than a domestic source. So thinking about that and saying, hey, what is the cost of the environmental impact, of the cost of the transportation, and does that all balance out for a responsible kind of supply chain in the future? Let's take the Amazon example, and in my family in particular. We get pretty close to a delivery a day, from Amazon for a variety of products. And, it's a nice, convenient, economical service to use. But there's no real impact on us of a decision around whether we should aggregate those orders and have them all delivered on Friday, because the cost savings isn't enough to get us to move the needle on our own. But if we were aggregating that so that everything showed up on Friday, that's basically one truck running at least the leg from the main street to my house, instead of 6 or 7. And so it's incumbent upon both the shippers and the consignees to not try to push the entire supply chain carbon footprint problem on the carriers, but also to recognize they have a large degree of ownership as well. Well, Blake, this is great. I really appreciate you making the time to sit down and have this conversation about such an important topic to our customer base around how do they build strong, resilient, sustainable supply chains of the future. Appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Ken. I think it's timely. It's important given everything going on right now in the environment. We've got wars going on that's impacting. These are all critical things that shippers that are on their minds, and so I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with you this afternoon.
And thanks to all of you for joining us for IntelliVision Episode 2. Have a great day.